Hey everyone, it's Jake Hall, the Manufacturing Millennial, and welcome back to another discussion of Automation Talks with Robotiq. If you're able to join us on our last webinar, we had some great conversations talking about palletizing in the food industry. And today we're going to break down another industry that we're seeing a lot of growth in, but also a lot of demand for automation, and that's talking about the pharmaceutical industry. And with me today, we have two amazing guests. As always, we have Ryan Weaver. Ryan, welcome back. Ryan is the commercial VP at Robotiq. And then, of course, we have Nick Lauzier, who is the senior product owner and who's really the palletizing expert that's going to be joining us today. And I think really what specifically we're talking about today is what the pharmaceutical industry is doing a lot of palletizing. Now, if you had a chance and you're in Chicago, we were at Pack Expo a couple of weeks ago, and we saw a lot of amazing content and really products that are going into the packaging industry. And I think one of the big things is as we're creating packaging, as we're creating products, a lot of those times those need to leave the manufacturing facilities. They need to leave the logistics facilities, and a lot of time that's being put on pallets. I think actually, Ryan, I made a post about a couple weeks ago. I think I was talking about pallets specifically, and I think in the US, there's something like 1.6 billion pallets that are used every single day in the US. Not necessarily shipped from like facility to facility, but the fact is the product's being stored on at 1.6 billion, and there's something along the lines of like 300 million pallets made, annually each year, which is just incredible.
It's mind blowing, and there's also a lot of variety. There's a lot of standardization, of course, around pallets. But if you've walked through a manufacturing floor, a production floor, and I'm sure that all of our viewers today have seen it, and they see it in their own production facilities, is the variety based on the individual requirements. You got different dimensions, different materials, different sizes. Sometimes it's not even a pallet. Sometimes it's a walled container. So being able to be adaptable to that process is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. So our goal for today's webinar is for you to get a better understanding of the current state of the industry, talk about what a deployment looks like, how you build up to that deployment through designing and integrating and deploying. Nick's going to bring us some expertise on that. But, Ryan, I kind of want to kick things off with when we have a lot of people who are already in the industry, but just as a refresher, we have some new people who are joining us. Could we kind of go into what the current state of palletizing looks like when we think of both manual operations when it comes to palletizing, when humans are doing it, and also what palletizing was when robots, and especially in the industrial robotic space, was first kicking things off. So let's talk about the manual side of palletizing to kick things off.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting. I was talking to an industry magazine editor recently, and one of the things that he was asking was, when it comes to the innovation in the packaging industry, what do you kind of see as the next great evolution in palletizing? And I said to myself, there are so many folks who can't even necessarily use the technology today, right? Or they aren't leveraging the technology today because what they're doing is manual palletizing, right? They're not even automating. Never mind what the next level is, right? So for them, the next level is moving beyond manual palletizing, and of course, there's some definite limitations to manual palletizing. The reason why you'd be maybe tuning in today, for example, it could be the ergonomics of it, health and safety factors. So the fact that usually these boxes they're not empty, right? So they're usually heavy enough where twisting and moving your back and forth all day can be quite strenuous, and that becomes a risk factor. The time involved, it's a lot of a person's time. Every minute they're palletizing, it's time they could be doing something else, and that leads into the human potential, of course. As a business leader, you always want your employees, your team, to be focused on the highest value tasks. The reality is palletizing product doesn't add any value to that end customer, right? It doesn't bring them any value besides just putting the product in a way that you can ship it. So there's a lot of other tasks that can be better suited. And the reality is that's if you can even find people to do that task today. So a lot of you are here probably today because you're struggling to find people to run the operations that you need long enough, or you're finding that those wages are skyrocketing, and really you'd rather pay those folks to be doing those higher value tasks. The
And I
other
think,
thing, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jake.
yeah, I was going to add to that, right now, because of labor shortages we're facing, a lot of times the jobs that manufacturers are trying to hire right now are these, what I would call boring, repetitive, ergonomic issued tasks where, you're going to hire someone in, they're going to stick around for a couple months. If they're not going to enjoy something, or they're going to go get a job that's 50 cents higher paying elsewhere, that they don't have to do these strenuous tasks, they're going to take it. So, but from what I would say a risk point of view from a manufacturer, it's not even the cost of that worker on the floor. It's the fact is, okay, now you have to go out and you have to have HR and you're recruiting people, go and find more people. And then you have to put in all the hours for getting them for onboarding. And then you're going to have the hours of all the training and all the HR and all this stuff. So you invested hundreds and hundreds of hours worth of work to have that person come and work for you for a very short limited time, because they found out that this is a boring task that I don't even want to do. Well, what if you were able to say, I'm still going to hire that person, I'm still going to go through the onboarding and training task, but I'm going to have them stick around for a lot longer than a 3-month period of time. That's just something that we don't even think about. And a lot of times it's because of these really just boring manual tasks.
No, it's a really great point. And of course, when we have folks who are disengaged, they're a lot more prone to making mistakes, right? And even you and I, if we're doing a palletizing task for 7, 8 plus hours a day, we're likely to make some errors. But those kind of errors in the current regulatory environment for the pharma industry, just it's not acceptable, right? And so what ends up happening is there's a lot of extra work that needs to go into pulling apart a pallet and rescanning everything in, because there was some error that was made in the process, and that kind of leads us to, well, what do you do if you can't?
I've seen this before as well, where I was sitting in a facility and the person's loading some of the wrong, so you have a bunch of conveyors coming down with product on it, and then the person picks up the product and puts it on the wrong conveyor. Well, now all of a sudden you have a mixed SKU pallet that you're having product getting shipped and a different pallet that shouldn't have been there. I mean, that's a common thing that I was sitting on lines watching that happen, where they're grabbing a box and they're putting it on the wrong thing. Like, that's way more common than I think a lot of people even think of.
Yeah, and then that whole pallet gets rejected by the customer, right?
Yeah.
So as you're seeing, Jake, right, a lot of people are turning to automation for those kind of jobs within the facility that are those dull, repetitive, fairly boring tasks. So automation, it's a great target, great opportunity for it, but it's all about how you automate it, right? And I don't know if you can give give the folks out there maybe a taste of what kind of has been the historic way of doing it, the more traditional way, right?
Well, I think for a long time, the traditional way of doing things, like what we're seeing here, is a large 4-axis industrial robot. A lot of times it's a complex integration process to make this happen. It has to have a ton of throughput to justify ROI. And with that, because you're going to have a systems integrator come in, you're going to have a lot of complex. And this way, we're seeing here, it's a lot of in-feed and out-feed pallets with a bunch of rollers and multiple lines. It's a complex integration process. And for a lot of what I would say, your small to medium-sized manufacturers who can't afford a, $500,000 plus to $1 million line, immediately they're put into a category of, we still have to do manual palletization. And I think the one thing that we're looking at here is the very high rate palletizing, where we're talking about putting out 200 plus boxes a minute on a palletizing line. There's going to be still a demand for the industrial robotic applications for the high speed stuff. But what we're finding out really quickly, especially in these smaller industries, is there's a demand for palletization where there's still a throughput, but a lot of times they're having a hard time putting that operator there, and the cost justification is a lot easier to qualify. So if I can go out there with a system that's a lot easier to deploy, that kind of we'll hear from Nick in a little bit, talking about I don't need a complex integrator with a lot of cost and a robot engineer and a full-time programmer to come and deploy something. If I can find something that meets more of my demand and my rate and my product size, There's some great opportunity to do palletization that was once just a very high rate industrial robot, high capital cost process. And I think what we're seeing is a new market open up for a lot of manufacturers who are saying, I still have rate, I still have product. Yeah, I might not be moving around 100-pound boxes. I might have boxes that, are 5, 10, 15 pounds. Now, all of a sudden, I fit into this new niche that allows me to do palletizing with what we're seeing now is collaborative robot deployment.
Exactly. And these are the kind of conversations I had at Pack Expo, which is really about people, their only awareness is around this kind of heavy, large scale industrial palletizing. And kind of the questions they're asking themselves is, well, my production is too varied for what I've seen in the past, or it's much smaller, or I don't have the footprint, right? So some of the questions that a lot of those folks need to be asking themselves is, one, how much floor space do you have to devote to something like this? Because the traditional way of doing it, you need a huge amount of space to dedicate an entire palletizing cell with all the safety cages and all that kind of stuff. The next thing to think about, particularly in a pharmaceutical standpoint, usually we're not talking about mom and pop shops, right? We're talking about a global organization. And so are you able to get that support globally, or are you working with just maybe a regional machine builder who is only able to do things in one specific area? From a external control standpoint, one thing that we've seen a lot is that when we're talking about the pharmaceutical space is centralizing the control of multiple packaging lines, so that we don't necessarily have let's say all the interface or control exposed just to kind of any operator walking by. Can it all be centralized and controlled externally? And then if you need to reconfigure, right, because you have to really quickly spool up a new SKU or product, are you able to do that quickly, or do you need to kind of call in that major integrator or machine builder in order for them to do a complete modification to the line? Or when you talk about Cobot palletizing, Jake, are you able to make that adaptation a lot easier? And maybe I'm foreshadowing a bit, but that's kind of what we see at Robotiq anyway, when we took the look at how can we make palletizing automation simpler for those who don't fit into that category of super high volume, large floor space dedication, and very rigid processes.
And I would add one thing onto that as well is the existing infrastructure, right? If I'm going out there, and I think a lot of times people think about what the robot deployment is, but what is your power consumption? What drops do you have available? And I think a lot of times when you are putting in a larger industrial robot for a lot of applications, your power requirements are a lot different. And versus when you look at a collaborative robot, all of a sudden I can take a standard 110 outlet, here in the US and get a plug-in. That's a lot different than going out there and having to run conduit, having to go put in a new MCC. Do I even have the power coming into my building that can supply stuff a lot of times? And a lot of larger manufacturing facilities do. And I think we recognize that, but still, there's a lot of infrastructure that even has to go out to. If you want to do a larger deployment, a lot of times you're doing a lot more plumbing, a lot more conduit, a lot more power drops. And I think what we're seeing here is rapid deployment. Hey, if I have a 110 receptacle, and a lot of times near me, that's my limitation in a lot of areas. That's just another thing to look at as well, where it's not even part of the main deployment of the system with the Cobot and the 7th axis. It's what's the infrastructure to get me there before I can even power it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at this point it'd probably be a great opportunity to ask Nick to jump in. Nick, maybe you can take us through a bit what again our take is on kind of that lightweight Cobot palletizing as you see there on the screen.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ryan. So the importance of our system, I would say one of the key advantages being standard, having a standard solution with a standard hardware and software. This really simplifies a lot of things. And basically, when you want to automate palletizing, usually with traditional automation, you would take you would start a conversation with different integrators, and you would present the project that you would like to do, and it would take months to get an answer. Is it feasible, and what kind of money you will need to chip in to make this happen? Using a standard Cobot solution like what we have, it allows to, and by the way, palletizing is a really standard application. So these two things together, it allows to do simulation and to do it in a very specific way for palletizing. So in our case, we have an online simulator, we call it the configurator, where you basically just enter your box dimensions and how they're positioned on the pallet, and you get an instant answer about, will this product work for this application and what kind of throughput you'll be able to match. It will also tell you if you need some specific tooling, or what kind of what's the impact of the conveyor positioning, for example. So right from the start, you're able to get answers quickly. And if you look at the automation projects in general, just figuring out what's the good solution for the problem usually takes a lot of time, and working with standard solution really streamline that part of the project.
And I think a cool thing about this too is there's a lot of Robotiq distributors that you guys have in multiple countries, but as an end user, you don't even have to have that. You yourself can go online and find out if this solution's right for you too. So I think that's one of those things, is we're almost democratizing, what palletization could look like in a lot of ways, where before, if you were an end user, you had to go to, an SI or a machine builder, where now you can get a lot better understanding of what it could look like for you within half an hour of investment time.
Exactly. And so our solution basically has linear access built in. So we provide everything beyond the Cobot, so all the linear access, everything to control it, the software to connect all of this together. And we have designed it to make sure that we are able to cover a wide range of application. And if you look at everything we've seen in the pharma industry, just using the standard pallet dimensions and the kind of height that you will need, with that Cobot solution, you'll be able to cover everything. The main question is often the payload, but otherwise just the pallet dimensions, it's for sure a good fit with this palletizer. Yep. And as I've explained, so everything for the pallet sensor, the status lights, all the shape of the hardware itself, the software that controls the robot, and take into account the shape of the obstacle. So basically the robot knows everything that's around and is able to do the motion without any collision all by itself. All of this is possible because the software, the hardware were designed all together for a specific robot. So it's a really well integrated product. And even in the pharma industry, what we've seen is that the end users always work with integrators, but basically even for the end users, having something that is really standard, really streamlined, really helps to smooth the integration process, and just making sure that on all the sites, on all the lines, it's possible to have the same solution, which greatly simplify all the acceptation tests that is typical in the pharma industry.
Maybe one thing just to jump in, Nick, I think when you hear integration out there, you might be thinking, oh, geez, my last, integration project for new machinery was, 3 months or 6 months long. I think there's a big difference in terms of what the integrators who are working with our palletizing solution and what you saw before with the really huge industrial arms. It's kind of apples and oranges, right? Usually we're dealing with a much more lightweight integration process that is really a matter of days, maybe a week or two from the very first moment you drop the palletizing solution on the floor. Usually you're palletizing on that first day, and then obviously getting everything tied in together with any conveyance lines or other inputs and outputs to the machinery. Really, we're not talking about the same kind of scale as that traditional big integration project.
Yep, exactly. And in the Cobot space, and we've seen this concept a lot with universal robots, for example, concept of lean integrators, where basically speed of deployment is really important, standardization, and also making sure that the end user can run and operate the system by themselves, and they are not hooked to all these hours that they need to get from these external integrators. So it's another way of deploying robots, and in the Cobot space, it's quite common. And for the palletizing specifically with this kind of solution, it's a really good fit with that concept. So the software itself is really a key component of all that system. So basically, our software, we call it Material Handling Copilot, and when you install it on the robot, it basically turns it into a palletizing machine. So instead of spending a lot of time just adding instructions, you're mainly programming with a visual interface that is made specifically for the palletizing application. So you only have 3 steps that can be done to make all the palletizing motion. So the first step is basically the dimensions of the product you want to palletize. So dimensions, payload, is the label orientation important, which is always the case in the pharma industry, and where the robot needs to go pick the product to palletize. So that's the only things you need to do at this stage. The second step is just the pallet dimensions. So we, of course, support all the ISO pallet dimensions, but you can have different kind of containers. That's an example that we've seen in the pharma industry. So walled containers and doing palletizing inside of it. So not necessarily only pallets like you see on the screen, but we can do a wide variety of them. And you have the opportunity to select if you want to palletize on both sides of the robot or only one side. So if you have a very tight spot with a really little footprint, it's possible to fit in and just palletizing on one side. Basically, the footprint of the solution is mostly the footprints of the pallets themselves.
Now with that as well, I can have it so each one of my pallets could be doing a different box as well, right? So if I was using a single conveyor that had a mixed skew of boxes coming down as a packaging line, I could have it where one product would be doing one side, another product would be doing another side, and I could have that variability built into it.
Exactly. So that's something that we've seen when the line throughput is small. So let's say you have 3 or 4 boxes per minute on one conveyor, and right next you have another one with the same kind of throughput. It's difficult to justify the ROI with one Cobot per line. Then it's a lot easier in this case to have a Cobot that is able to pick from 2 different conveyors to build 2 different pallets. And at this, so the third step is really to, it's the really visually being able to position the boxes on the different patterns. So basically, you tell the system where the boxes need to be, where the labels need to be oriented for scanning, for example, externally on the pallet, and you define a few patterns and how they are alternating on the different layers. So that's a key part of it, and it's all done visually right on the robot, so you don't need to have an external system to do it. Yep. So when you have done these things, the system knows everything it needs to know to do the palletizing motion. And because the pallet is already referenced, everything is designed all together, so the robot knows where the pallet is. It knows if the pallet is present or not because of the sensors. It has this different status. It knows the obstacles around. It knows the conveyor, where it is, what's its shape. So with all this information, all the palletizing motion is done automatically. And if you have an integrator that can set up all your system, but the 3 steps that we've just seen, if you have a new product, it's something that can normally be done by an operator. So that's something that is easily done to just add new products on the fly as you need it.
And I think what's really cool as we're looking at this process so far is a lot of times older business owners have a hard time deploying this technology, saying, oh man, this is something that I'm not familiar with. This graphical interface, going online and programming stuff. But it's one of those things where just for me as a millennial, we're excited about this because a lot of the deployment here feels almost like just like an app that we play with on our iPad or something like that. And it's just one of those things where you want to empower that future workforce. This future workforce gets it for deployment. I mean, a lot of high school students know how to program a propeller board and an Arduino board and a Raspberry Pi now. Now all of a sudden we're seeing, hey, this deployment is just a graphical interface where, on the previous slide where I can go out there, set what my palletization layout looks like, and I just rotate whatever the direction I want my box to be so my barcode lays out. It almost feels like, programming a Lego Mindstorm set, in terms of just dragging and dropping, the programming style of it. So just wanted to add that from watching this.
Yeah, and you're right. It's a very natural way to just say to the robot what it needs to do, and that's something that people get it quite fast. So maybe it's a good time to show a few examples of what it looks like when it is deployed. So here you have an OEM solution from the Uptel group. So Uptel is really well known in the pharma industry because of the traceability technology that they provide. So really present in a lot of different companies in the pharma world. And if you look at all their equipment, they've been able to use our palletizing solution to complete the line. So basically making sure that when you have everything packaged and traced and quality control at the end, the palletizing is done using a Cobot solution that is using our product. And in this case, the palletizer, the Cobot, was deployed by Vanguard Robotics, which is a lean integrator that specializes in deploying Cobot in the pharma industry. So really simple way. So it's a really good match with all the existing kind of technology that are present in the pharma industry. So this second example here, it shows a bit the small footprint that we can have when we deploy a solution. So if there's an existing conveyor with a line with someone doing manual palletization, it's quite easy to use the exact same footprint and just making sure that the palletizing is not done by a person with all the injuries that comes by, but is now done by a robot. So it can be deployed in a standard way, a standalone system with just a sensor to detect if there's a box, and everything else is managed by the system itself. And we have also another example, so third example, where it shows a bit what we were explaining before. So when you have a more complete line with an automation project where everything is controlled centrally, you can have one or many palletizers that are working well, controlled by this external system. So it's something that we've seen many times in the pharma industry. So the whole line, for example, is controlled through a centralized HMI, and in this context, our palletizing solution fits really well into that concept.
And I think it's kind of showing there too, it's expandable, right? As my product line grows, I can just add onto my main conveyor line with my kickoffs and just keep building things as I go along as well.
Yep, I think the concept is called the incremental automation. So basically, instead of spending millions all at once and having to redesign the whole facility, you can spend a fraction of it chunk by chunk and getting a good ROI for that specific investment without having to redesign everything. So that's a really good point.
And it's really a stark contrast, I think, the amount of floor space taken up by these cells, as you see on the floor here, versus more that traditional that we had shown at the very beginning.
Yep. So I think, Jake, I'll let you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that insight, Nick. That was really cool to see. I think it's one of those things where, as I mentioned earlier, just the way we can configure things these days is dramatically different. I remember 5 or 6 years ago was the biggest thing for me when I was in automation distribution. I could go online and I could configure a conveyor. And I could hey, this is the width of this conveyor, this is the length of this conveyor, and explain to people you can go online, you don't need to have a sales rep come in anymore and do this. Now we can do that with robotic deployment. It's exciting just to see how easy to determine if a solution is going to be for you, and get information back that quickly. So thanks so much for that insight, Nick. Well, I guess that wraps up today's webinar. We're talking about, last session was palletization, and today we're talking about pharmaceuticals. And then of course next week, or excuse me, not next week, but for the next presentation, we're going to be talking about machine tending and automation. I think that one's really exciting for me too, especially for the amount of machine builders, machining shops that are out there right now doing CNC, doing a lot of additive and subtractive manufacturing. Machine tending is definitely a topic that's out there, but I think it's one of the biggest discussions because a lot of times lights out operation is one of the biggest things that I think we're seeing from machine tending. So of course, we'd love for you to join us on November 16th. Put that in the calendar right now, and of course, register for that presentation as well. And we'll see you then in a couple weeks. But in the meantime, Ryan, thank you once again for joining us, and Nick as well. And of course, if you have any questions, we would love to hear them, and we'll get back with him shortly.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks,
Cool.
Jake. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.